Hi, welcome back. It shifted from 80 degrees to snow overnight. And yeah, here I am. We left off at the end of chapter 2. There's just a little bit left, and then I'll go straight into chapter 3 and just keep reading. Working with food issues. Let us explore one last arena of physical healing, and that is dietary self-help. I agree with John Bradshaw, who says that almost everyone who grows up in a dysfunctional family has an eating disorder. This is a key factor in the digestive tract problems that are a common symptom of PTSD. Changing your eating habits is extremely difficult. A client left a quote on my waiting room bulletin board. Alcohol and other drug recovery is like dealing with a tiger in a cage. Recovery from eating disorders is like taking that tiger out of the cage 3 times a day and then taking it for a walk. Deconstructing food addictions, then, is daunting work that needs to be approached gradually and with a sense of compassion. This is because children who are traumatically abandoned naturally turn to food for comfort. Food offers us our first outside source of self-soothing, and when a child is starving for love, he frequently makes food his love object. Over the years, he commonly elevates it to the status of a drug. Moreover, increasing scientific evidence is showing that processed food products combining higher levels of sugar, salt, and fat are especially addictive. Food addictions begin pre-verbally. They are functional and useful at the time and help us to survive the unbearable feelings of the abandonment melange. Unfortunately, we are typically forced to rely on food soothing for so long that our overdependence is extremely difficult to overcome. I do not recommend that anyone in early recovery make this their primary focus unless they have a life-threatening food issue. Instead, I prefer to recommend Mate's harm reduction approach. Additionally, Janine Roth's book, Breaking Free from Compulsive Eating, also offers a moderate and sensible approach to dietary improvement. While many survivors can be unconscious of their damaging eating habits, I have met various survivors who take it to the opposite extreme. I was once in the ranks of those who obsessively overfocus on dietary self-help, hoping and expecting that all their suffering will be resolved if they can just find the perfect diet. Many also chase after every new highly touted supplement in this pursuit. Some of us also approach exercise in this manner. There are understandable but simplistic versions of the salvation fantasy, and are typically pursued at the exclusion of working on more core issues of recovering. Nonetheless, almost everyone has some idea about how they can eat and exercise more healthily. My recommendation is to try dietary adjustments when you can on a moderate, doable level. Chapter 3. Improving Relationships. Forewarning. There are instances of parental betrayal so extreme that it is not fair or reasonable to expect the survivor to try to trust human beings again. If the recommendation in this chapter to open to help of others feels too upsetting or overwhelming, please feel free to skip this chapter. There is a great deal of other material in this book that can help alleviate the many symptoms of PTSD. And since recovery is relative and never complete, you do not need to implement everything in this book. As they say in the 12-step movement, take the best and leave the rest. Moreover, as I have experienced personally, and as numerous of my clients and website respondents have demonstrated to me, real relational healing can and does come from non-human sources. This is especially true of mammalian pets whose attachment needs and wiring are similar enough to ours that mutually healing connections can evolve between us. Dogs and cats can be a tremendous source of what Carl Rogers describes as the unconditional positive regard that young children must have in order to thrive. Other therapeutic relational sources include nature, music, and the arts. Moreover, for some survivors, authors of helpful books can be kept at a safe distance while they contribute to your healing. Finally, even with the most heinous betrayals, miracles sometimes happen in terms of discovering a healing human connection, particularly in the later stages of recovery. See PTSD as an attachment disorder. Many therapists see PTSD as an attachment disorder. This means that as a child, the survivor grew up without a safe adult to healthily bond with. As bears repeating, CPTSD almost always has emotional neglect at its core. A key outcome of this is that the child has no one in his formative years who models the relational skills that are necessary to create intimacy. When the developmental need to practice healthy relating with a caretaker is unmet, survivors typically struggle to find and maintain healthy, supportive relationships in their adult lives. The origins of social anxiety. A child who grew up with no reliable human source of love, support, and protection typically falls into a great deal of social unease. He naturally becomes reluctant to seek support from anyone, and he is forced to adopt self-sufficiency as a survival strategy. Needing anything from others can feel especially dangerous. The survivor's innate capacity to experience comfort and support in relationship becomes very limited or non-existent. This is despite the fact that many high-functioning survivors learn to socially function quite adequately. This is particularly the case in structured situations where expectations are clear and common goals take the focus off conversing and put it on the task's accomplishment. Unstructured social situations, however, like attending parties or just hanging out, can be considerably more triggering. Spontaneous self-expression feels like the same setup for disaster that it was in childhood. Either way, structured or spontaneous, relating often involves hiding a great deal of anxiety and discomfort. One very successful businessman client of mine told me, "I'm so cool, calm, and collected in meetings, a veritable wordsmith with the composure of Michael Caine. I'm a king on the outside, but then on the inside I'm a drama queen, anguishing in doubt and shame about everything I do or say." In worst case scenario, social anxiety can devolve into social phobia, especially during prolonged flashbacks. Extensive childhood abuse installs a powerful "people are dangerous" program. When I was at my least recovered, I couldn't take out the garbage when I was in a flashback. I feared that my neighbor, my sweet, always affirming neighbor, would look out the window and see how wretched and pitiful I was. Even worse, I dreaded the prospect that she might come out and want to interact with me. Nonetheless, I socialized for decades when necessary, and seemed to be doing it with considerable amounts of success. No matter how dreadful the reviews were from my critic, I even eventually came to see, when not in flashback, that a lot of people really liked me. Unfortunately, however, I rarely derived any satisfaction or comfort from this perception, because underneath my smooth persona, I was writhing in discomfort, and typically measuring the time until I could least obtrusively make my escape. The journey of relational healing. The incident I'm about to describe marked a huge step in my long, gradual journey of opening to real intimacy. I was sitting on my porch with my dog, George, the only being I could truly relax with, when he broke his lead and sprinted across the street in pursuit of a cat. Before he could get to the cat, he was run over by a car. Both axles run over. It was the worst thing that had ever happened in my adult life, and when the shock disassociation wore off, I was drowning in the abandonment melange. Beyond devastated, I felt panicky and catatonic at the same time. As I had to in childhood when feeling overwhelmed, I hid in my room for 36 hours. Dreading contact with my fair-weather friend roommates, I was 28 and still thoroughly phobic about showing any vulnerability. All my relationships had been developed under a guise of me people-pleasing. My people-pleasing funny guy persona. And in my current state, there was not a joke anywhere to be found. There was no way I could let myself be seen in what felt like a repulsive condition. I could not sleep, and as sleep deprivation deteriorated into a fear that I was truly going crazy, Out of nowhere came this amazing grace. Grace disguised in the form I usually abhorred. It was the great grace of deep surrender into weeping. A long, sobbing release, more soothing than anything I had experienced before. It was the release I described more in chapter 11 and extensively throughout my first book. When the tears were cried out, I knew I would be okay, and I knew I was not going to go crazy. I could face my roommates with the realest, perhaps the first sense of self-esteem I had ever known. And from that point on, I knew I wanted more of these incredibly healing tears. Healing the shame that binds us in loneliness. I soon discovered, however, that my tears were as stuck as they had ever been. Or at least since I was 6, the last time I could remember crying. Further reading and researching then led me to seek help, and so ensued my baptism into therapy. Blessed by the great fortune of finding a good enough therapist on my first try. This was a milestone achievement for me, and it evolved into a long, meandering journey of finding more relational help with an array of healers, therapists, therapeutic groups, and deeper friendships. These experiences range from extremely helpful to counter-therapeutic. But as time went on, they became increasingly helpful. A central aspect of the truly helpful relational work was that what John Bradshaw called healing the shame that binds. I believe toxic shame cannot be healed without some relational help. Several therapists and groups aided me greatly to unbind from the shame that made me hide whenever I could not invoke my perfect persona. Concurrently, I learned that real intimacy correlated with the amount I shared my vulnerabilities. As I increasingly practiced emotional authenticity, the glacier of my lifelong loneliness began to melt. It is important to know here that groups can be more powerful for healing of shame than individual work. This is because there is typically more mutual vulnerability in a group than in individual work. Moreover, feeling compassion for someone who has suffered similarly to us sometimes naturally expands into feeling the same for ourselves. Therapeutic relational experiences enhance my self-compassion considerably further than what I was able to accomplish on my own. Moreover, I believe that insufficient self-compassion is the worst developmental arrest of all. And restored self-compassion is the keystone of all effective recovery. In retrospect, I can clearly see that as my self-compassion increased, my toxic shame decreased. Modern advances in neuroscience, see A General Theory of Love, suggests that we are intrinsically limited in our ability to emotionally regulate and soothe ourselves. More and more research suggests that our ability to metabolize painful emotion states is enhanced by communicating with a safe enough other person. Finding good enough relational help. In chapter 13, I provide guidance about how to shop for a good enough therapist. I also explore more deeply the principle of therapeutic relational healing to help you know what is reasonable to expect from your therapist. I've also met a number of survivors who have been lucky enough to get this kind of relational healing from a partner or a friend. Typically one who had good enough parents or who has a lot of recovery. Finally, attachment theorists have developed the concept of earned secure attachments to describe the recovered enough state where the attachment disorder of PTSD becomes sufficiently healed. This is typically evidenced by the survivor forming at least one supportive and reliable enough relationship. Many of the successful therapies I have guided come to an end when the client gains an earned, secured relationship outside of our therapy. This is typically a partner or best friend with whom the person can truly be themselves. Another potential source of relational healing is the co-counseling relationship. Guidelines for creating co-counseling relationships are also contained in Chapter 13. Many respondents to my website have reported glowingly about the help they get from others through online recovery groups and forums. These groups can be particularly helpful for those who still find it difficult to be vulnerable in person. Sometimes the distance and relative anonymity of these forums can decrease the fear of self-disclosure, and this can enhance therapeutic relating. An increased number of therapists also seem to be offering telephone sections for this same reason. The section Finding an Online Group in Chapter 13 lists recommended online groups. Parentectomy and relational healing. I've worked with many clients who began therapy with me while they were still over-controlled by their traumatizing parents, both externally as well as internally. Sometimes the control was enforced by as little as one phone call a week. Not infrequently, these clients were also being overpowered and/or abandoned in relationships as abusive and neglectful as the ones they had with their parents. This is repetition compulsion at its most destructive. It strands survivors in experiencing the worst of both worlds. Through an in-depth exploration of their childhood trauma, many of my still trapped clients achieve psychological freedom from their parents for the first time in their lives. Once again, this was a freedom that they had not actually achieved, though they had been living on their own for decades. These clients gradually learned to live more successfully on their own without their parents' over-controlling, spoiling influence. Their ability to build self-nurturing relationships with themselves almost always correlated with a major reduction of complete severing of their relationship with their parents. My client Joe, who was variously misdiagnosed as schizoid, Asperger's, and paranoid, was living alone when he began therapy with me. He was extremely shut down and self-contained, but recognized himself as a freeze type from reading articles on my website. Getting him to talk at first was like pulling teeth. Over time, I discovered that he was engaged in daily phone contact with his narcissistic, emasculating mother. Through our work and tremendous courage on his part, he gradually reduced the phone contact with his mother, at first to once a week and then once a month and then only major holidays, and after a few years to almost never. When a parent is unrelentingly toxic, hearing even a few words from them can trigger the survivor into an intense emotional flashback. I have worked with numerous clients who have made very little progress in their recovery while they maintain contact with the toxic parents. For this reason, such clients usually require a parentectomy to progress. There is a classic book by Bob Hoffman on the topic entitled Getting Divorced from My Mother and Dad. As an external freedom from mothering continued, Joe gradually achieved